All right, Steve Wood, recovered alcoholic. And
And my name is Howard Eber, I am a recovered addict and alcoholic.
so welcome to the Great Rally Big Book Study. Last week we talked about we did a lot of all over the place history of alcoholism addiction, and we got into the laws and the tortures of ancient times. We talked about the Revolutionary War. You can find us on YouTube. We did last week. All our stuff's on YouTube, by the way. We can put a link up there in the chat. But we talked about the Revolutionary War in America and how the colonists averaged almost 6 gallons of pure alcohol per day. Not alcohol, but pure alcohol. But we got into, and this is where the AA stuff started to kind of come in. We talked about Benjamin Rush, and he was signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a forefather in the United States. He said saved George Washington's life, so he's a kind of like a made man. But he was like the first Surgeon General, and he called alcoholism a disease, and there was some type of physical aspect with it. And he recommended moral treatment, but he never described what the moral treatment was, so there's no recovery plan. So that fell, and then we talked about the temperance movement, and we might mention that a few more times. But temperance was how to drink moderately. And at first they focused on teaching people who are alcoholic or to drink moderately, and when that didn't work, they focused on people who barely drank at all. And then they had the Absence Society, but then the group we ran through last week was the Washingtonians. And while most other groups um they had a they had no recovery plan, or a solution, um like the Absence Society was, might be absence or moderation, might be their solution, but actually the recovery plan for Washingtonians was fellowship, and they fell flat in their face. There were 700,000 members at one time, and they disappeared. And we also talked about the uh, the darkness of the opium dilemma during the Civil War, and it leads up to a lot of stuff we're talking about going forward. But 30,000 soldiers became addicted. 300,000 soldiers became addicted, not 30,000, 300,000. And, you know, to counter the opium addiction, the solution was a new drug called heroin, which, created more addicts, new laws. So they had another drug to counter to go against heroin. That was cocaine. We can't make this stuff up. It's just. So we entered the 1900s in the US with 50,000 alcoholics and addicts. 50,000. And, they're one of the first ways to combat it, was inebriate asylums. And I talked quite a bit about that last week. And the inebriate asylums was basically a torture house. I mean, they were lobotomy. There was no rules there because it was a new system. Back in those days, if Howard wanted to start a new medical practice, he could go in there and do whatever he wants until they catch up, and they would say, oh, you got your licenses cleared, and here's the rules. But he could break all the rules before that. What's the inebriate asylums did. And eventually they were declared inhumane, and that was kind of a new word at that time. But so just to run through it is, so Benjamin Rush solution was abstinence, recovery plan none. Temperance movement was solution with moderation, recovery plan none. The Absence Society was solution, abstinence, recovery plan none. Washingtonian was solution, abstinence, and well, actually their recovery plan was fellowship. And the inebriate asylum solution was incarceration with no recovery plan. So you kind of see the pattern of these. There's only one that had a recovery plan with fellowship, and that didn't work. Um, it's interesting. Not one of those really. I mean, I don't know if they even knew what recovery was. Howard, did you want to mention anything towards that stuff at all?
Yeah, I just wanted to interject something before we went too far beyond it. Um, a friend of ours, Mitchell Klein, who wrote How It Worked, the story of Clarence Snyder and the days of Akron's foundation. He sent me something this week that I wanted to pass along to you. It has to do with the Washingtonians, and it's an interesting look into what they were trying to do. So if you give me a second, let me put this up for you because it really opened my eyes. I didn't realize this was going on. And well, you'll see what you think. See if you find any of this familiar, comparing it to our preamble and to our traditions. He sent me this. This is a flyer, a booklet called the 1842 Washingtonians. And I've highlighted a couple of sections of it. If I just, let me just move to the next page here. See if this stuff does not sound familiar. It says these difficulties were mainly the apprehensions of evil influence being introduced into the action of the society to divert them from their simple purpose, right? The singleness of purpose was what they're referring to. And it said that the society as such was to recognize no creed or religion, nor party in politics, neither political or religious action of any kind should ever be introduced into the society's operation. Personal abstinence from all intoxicating drinks was the basis, the only requisite for membership, right? The only requirement for membership is to stop drinking. And it says, and to be the only, oops, I'm sorry. Let me go back to that page, that last line. It said moral suasion, and moral suasion is an interesting term. Moral suasion just means it's a technique that's used to convince people through the use of values, through the use of morals as an influencing factor. And
Hmm.
so they were saying moral suasion, and I jumped to the wrong page here. Moral suasion was the only means by which they as a body were to introduce themselves to adopt their principles. As a society, their whole business was to induce others not to drink intoxicating liquors. Moreover, they determined that the regular meetings of their society, listen to this, should be meetings for the detail of personal experience, not debates, lectures, or speeches, that even on matters of necessary business, as few remarks as possible would be tolerated. Thus, all temperance addresses were to be in the form of personal experience of the several members, only relating their experience. The spirit of this rule and common sense were to guide them how far any should be allowed to go in his remarks. And continuing, immediately after the organization of the society, the several members went privately to their friends, especially their former drinking associates, and persuaded them in the spirit of kindness to abandon strong drink and join the society. So much for attraction rather than promotion. To every excuse and plea they could that could not reform, they would reply by referring to their own experience. And they generally clung to a man until they persuaded him to give up the bottle. How's that one?
Hmm.
They hung on to people until they stopped drinking. And get this, watch this next one. It says, when such a man was in the condition, each member on the evening of the meeting, instead of going alone and waiting for his friend, would go to his house or to the grog shop. The grog shop was the bar, the liquor store, wherever that guy hung out. They would go get him and bring him to a meeting. So it's a couple of interesting things that the Washingtonians did so you could see where their mistakes led to our rules, our traditions, our preamble. So I'll leave it at that for now.
I like that. It's good stuff. You know, the I was thinking about that as how I was going too. It's like think about the last 100 years in alcoholism addiction research treatment has changed in the last 100 years. Society looks at alcoholism in a totally different light today. There's a disease concept that's hopefully is widely accepted. Treatment programs have became established, and we have huge, I mean, big advancements in psychological and you know you know and even neurology, like, consequence of alcoholism. But the thing that stands out is, like, the role of lack of spiritual wholeness is the main emphasis of the steps, is to find that. And it's almost, it was always like an AA secret, but now people talking about it all over the place now. Like, they look at us in a different manner, like almost like, okay, I get what they're saying now. And, you know, and, spearheaded the groundbreaking Alcoholics Anonymous, all that did. And it's like, we think about it. I mean, we went through hundreds and hundreds of years of tortures and stuff last week. And then the last 100 years, all of a sudden, bam, even the last 50 years, 60, 75 years, 85 years. So last week, I let off with the Anibra asylums in 1920. They ended. So I want to go to 1913, and this is stuff reason we're going with stuff is we want to give you guys a backdrop of Alcoholics Anonymous in the 30s when the book was written. And to do that, I got to give a little history on this. And so 1913, Woodrow Wilson was elected president, and before he was president, he was the leader of the progressive movement, and that was a group that wanted a better and safer society. They wanted everything to be great, and they they did help close inebriate asylums. They actually took on the church a little bit too, for like shut down churches that were like taking money from people and stuff. We don't see that too much today, but he got elected president. And in 1914, an attempt to regulate drugs, the Harrison Act was passed, which prohibited the sale of morphine, cocaine, heroin, except clause by licensed doctors and pharmacies. So if you got a good doctor, you could still get your stuff. Um, but that was eventually outlawed in the 50s, I believe. Um, So that made drugs illegal. And soon after the Heroin Act soon after that, what was passed was the Heroin Act, which the Heroin Act was making heroin totally outlawed. Not even a doctor could give it, even for medical purposes. And it's because they were finding people dead in the sidewalks, and it was a scary place. And it was like, it was also heroin was brought up as a racial drug. It was a drug only African Americans use, and we're going to blame it on them, and blah blah blah. And the truth was, there's a lot of people using it, and even to this day. But so that was done. Many looked at Harrison Act. Was a spearhead to prohibition. So in 1919, with the assistance of a lot of politicians and churches, the temperance movement people, the Volstead Act was passed, and prohibition with the prohibition of alcohol. So alcohol, like drugs, was now illegal. So one thing I want to mention is back in those days, um, prior to that, well, actually, I'll just keep going because I don't want to get ahead of myself. But the intention of prohibition was to control alcohol consumption and crime, and leading to you know get away from legal activities, and just to change society and help work production. It was so the temperance movement, so I want to bring that in there, is they their efforts sought to address alcoholism and create more of a productive society by making booze illegal, and it actually reversed on them a lot. People didn't want to hear them anymore. But the backdrop of this prohibition time was the area act time called the Roaring Twenties, and major economic growth in our country, new inventions, new technology. You had the automobile has been around for a while, but what was invented was was created was assembly line. So now there's mass production of cars. It changed the way we traveled and got around. There was new home appliances, the refrigerator, vacuum, all this, washing machines. I mean, might be a little off there, but because of radio, advertising and marketing created a demand for all these new products and borrowing, and people became rich. during the 20s and created more jobs. And like I mentioned, radio broadcasts created a whole new way of entertainment. Variety shows, the first baseball game, I think it was 1921, um, on radio. Music, of course. Movie going became the was the new pastime. People would dress up really nice because these emergence of these talkies movies. And then there was some people called the drug age, but it was the jazz age, which was a huge impact on American culture. And like I said, a big part of that was drugs and heroin, alcohol. Um, when World War One was happening, um, and men went away to war, women started working. When the war ended, women said, we still want to work." So they became part of the workforce. So that was a big change in this country. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, giving women the rights to vote, with women gaining more rights. That, there was more liberation. The flapper age was there. You know, traditional norms started. Women started wearing short dresses. You're not supposed to wear short dresses. And then short hair. You're not supposed to have short hair. And they enjoyed the social activities that were only reserved for men. And the big question during this time in Prohibition, was America actually dry? And Prohibition, the new drug laws, did nothing to reduce alcohol and drug intake at all. And one of the biggest complaints about alcohol and distribution before Prohibition was liquor companies took advantage of the rich people, especially when the 20s hit. So the alcohol they sold was high in proof, very expensive. They called the smooth stuff. And the problem was there was no middle class. There was rich and poor. So the non-wealthy were forced to already start making their own booze. This is before Prohibition. And going when Prohibition started in 1919, all those companies that made alcohol shut down, and the rich people had to go to the poor people to get alcohol. So it's very interesting. And here's you know yeah. So during Prohibition, there was no watered down alcohol. 80 proof vodka did not hit the United States until after Prohibition because they want to make more money. But and tequila came in. All the stuff, the watered down beer was after that. So Prohibition, but because they introduced cheap you know stuff after that. But in Prohibition, we're talking 130 proof or higher. So instead of destroying the alcohol and drug trade, distribution moved underground, meaning Prohibition led to a huge rise in organized crime. Tons of money. Drug lords became rock star. Al Capone. We would never even know who Al Capone was if it wasn't for Prohibition, because he made an estimate $60 million during it, and that's a lot of money back then. But the interesting thing was something was called the speakeasy. They're legal hidden bars, and where it was alcohol. So it wasn't just alcohol and drugs that people went to speakeasy for. There was alcohol, drugs, gambling, prostitution, and they range from being inside fancy jazz clubs in the back rooms to you know dingy back rooms of restaurants and delicatessens. Even inside basements of people's houses or apartments. People would rent an apartment and turn it into a speakeasy. And I went to New York in 2002, 2003, and I went to the World Service, and this guy came in there, and he wasn't an official AA guy, but he says, "I'll take you guys on a tour if you want to go." And he charged like $10 or something like that for like 10 of us to go. And it was cool. I mean, he took us through this delicatessen. It's an Italian restaurant. You walked in the back door, and there was this what looked like a walk-in. You walked in there, you opened the walk-in. It was a long hallway. You walked all the way down the hallway behind the 8 other businesses, or 20 probably, until you hit this large room, and it was still there. I mean, it was a commercialized, but it was a speakeasy. I mean, you could go in the front door normally there now, but it was a former speakeasy. It was very interesting. and and you gotta remember in these days, you know, uh, you know, one of the things they did, to hide the poorly distilled bathtub gin, the speakeasies that offered combination of alcohol with ginger ale and Coca-Cola and lemon. They didn't have drinks before then. It was straight shots. That's introduced the cocktail. So it's really interesting. But it wasn't just that. Speakeasies also had vaporized alcohol machines where you can inhale alcohol through oxygen, allowing the consumer to, have a mixture of, you know, you go to your bloodstream, put it that way. Intense, very intense. So speakeasies alone had 32,000. And Howard, do you want to say anything on this stuff? Oh,
No, I'll keep going. I'll jump in later. I want when we get to the Washington, to the Oxford groups. You keep going.
okay. So the economy collapse of 1929, had the stock market crash, started the Great Depression. So prohibition in the Roaring Twenties came to a screeching halt, and you know, so basically prohibition started with the end of World War One and ended with the Great Depression. And the reason prohibition ended actually was in 33 was not because it was a failed experiment, because of the Great Depression. It ended. They needed jobs. They needed alcohol tax. That was the main reason, and but drugs stayed legal. And the rumors were, and this is very interesting, I heard a guy speak on this one night. There was serious talk about making drugs legal, but organized crime lords threatened to kill a bunch of people if they did, because they wanted to make money off of that. So this will lead more into the Oxford Group area. So around 1900, now we're getting into recovery. It's this movement started out of Boston, um, called the Emmanuel Movement. And they had about 30,000 members at their peak. And they basically were the first treatment center. They organized groups using medical professional treatment for alcohol and addicts. And they did what was called house calls. The doctor would come to your home and diagnose you and put you under a nurse's care and detox you. And, they had trained psychologists to work with you. And they used former clients called lay therapists as your mentor. Sounds like sponsorship system. But the requirement was the alcoholic must have a personal desire to stop drinking, accept total abstinence, commit to group therapy, commit to counseling, and commit to being mentored by a lay therapist. Pretty interesting. And they emphasize the healing power of faith and spirituality. Now we're getting something different. Their approach was therapy was holistic, addressing the individual's psychological, emotional, and spiritual needs. So they're focused on religion and spirituality. So they're greatly influenced. Their biggest influence was the William James book, Variety of Religious Experience. The guys who put it together that's what they used. So they wanted to have you'd have a spiritual conversion, but the problem was this: they didn't have a plan to get you there. They had no plan to get you there. And another problem, like the Washingtonians, did not fully understand the nature of alcoholism. No disease concept. And most of all, they got greedy, made too much money. And in 1930, it ended in 1933. It went in different forms, but they had solution was spirituality recovery plan none. But there's two interesting therapists that came up out of the manual movement. The first one, and they both have their fingerprints all over AA history. The first one's Courtney Baylor, and he was a therapist and a lay minister. And he went through the Emmanuel Movement's program as a lay therapist for a while, and then he went full on and became a regular therapist. But he stayed, he has a lay minister. But his therapeutic approach was holistic, combining spiritual and medical. But he worked with individuals, not just studying with addiction and alcoholism, but personal issues as well. But his focus was developing a greater self-awareness to examination of behaviors, seeking, I could say, personal spiritual growth and change, so self-awareness. And the plan he used was not called recovery, it was called reconstruction, which was rebuilding and restructuring the person's life. And it required 1 year commitment, 1 year, a lot of time and effort. It's a 1 year you had to put in there. And it consisted of, he did this encouragement. I don't know much about it, but he did this, I don't know if he did encouragement, but he also did something that's very interesting called moral inventory, which was a big focus on the self-awareness. Now, my theory is that that might be something somewhere that Bill got to, and I'll explain that later. But so more inventory, then there's confession, high emphasis on self-disclosure, addressing the individual's physical, emotional, and spiritual needs, seeing spiritual healing and spiritual discovery. But the living, you know, he wanted them to live a life of integrity and ethical behavior. And his long-term aim was personal and spiritual growth. Baylor was a huge influence on the Oxford group, particularly the guys who wrote the Oxford group books, because he had a lot of medical journals he wrote, which because they, and Oxford group's focus was spiritual growth and personal transformation. And Baylor, also he foreshadowed the modern counselor, but he was a very important part of forming AA because one of his clients was Roland Hazard, and it kind of links together, and we'll get into that where he falls, where Roland, he falls into place with Roland Hazard, and we'll get when we get to that level. But the second guy, and Howard's pretty familiar with this guy, this is their other therapist, was Richard Peabody. And after he went to treatment, he became a lay therapist like Baylor, and then a paid therapist, and he created a private practice in New York. And he has some whacked out beliefs. He believed that the causes of alcoholism were a nervous system that was affected by alcohol, family environment and upbringing, the influence of marriage and college, or even work temperament. So he had some interesting thing, but Peabody did not believe in any disease concept at all. And his recovery plan was teaching alcoholic to bring feelings and emotions under control. Good luck. And he looked at alcoholism as like I said, a nervous, condition. And he's partially right there, but you're probably thinking, why am I talking about this guy? Well, in 1931, he wrote a book called Common Sense of Drinking. And it's a very different book in its time, and it was groundbreaking. Books before had, his always described drinkers as drunkards and drunks. And he used medical terms that came from medical people, like alcoholic and alcoholism, terms, who outside the medical field maybe never heard before. It's not surprising it was really closely read by early A members. And it's also not surprising that when writing the big book, Bill Wilson, you know, one thing he had, I'll let Howard talk about him a little bit. You want to talk about Peabody?
Uh, yeah, sure. Um, I was just putting something in the chat here about Peabody. Let me just drop that in there in
I'll
case.
I'll, I'll I'll mention this before he gets set
All
up.
right.
He had the italic writing in his book, and that's one thing Bill Wilson. Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah, Emily just put up the cover of Common Sense of Drinking, which was a book written by Richard Peabody that I think you may find very interesting. If you haven't read the book, I strongly suggest you do, because you're going to find a lot of things that are in Common Sense of Drinking that have been liberated, had been lifted and adopted into our big book. And I'll show you what I mean. Let me put this up here, give you some ideas about what that's about. Um, Common Sense of Drinking. Now, there's a lot of different covers of the book. I have this one in this red cover, and I'm going to give you some page numbers that may not link up with the copy that you have, depending on the printing that you have. But let's just go through this a little bit. Certain pages I've picked out. Here's something. Oops, that happened. This is not what I want. Hang on. I apologize for that. That is not the one that I wanted. Let me get you the one I do want. I'm sorry. Let's try this one. This should be it. Ah, yes. Okay. Okay. Here's a picture of Richard Peabody. But here's what I was talking about. Let's take a look at some of the things that he wrote about. Here's a section on page 31 where he says, the man, after 36 years of living and approximately 16 of drinking, had definitely proved to his own conviction he couldn't use alcohol without abusing it, and by his own efforts, he was equally powerless to stop his indulgence. Does that not sound like the first gentleman in More About Alcoholism, who realized that he had no control over alcohol, that if he was to succeed, he would have to stop drinking? Well, let's continue with this guy. Um, let's continue with that guy for what it's worth. Let's complete that thought. Some years ago, there lived a man who decided to give up drinking until he could make $1 million, at which time he intended to drink in moderation. It took him 5 years of sobriety to make the million. Then he began his moderate drinking. In 2 or 3 years, he lost all his money, and in another three, he died of alcoholism. Now, some of the details are a little bit different in More About Alcoholism, but the gist of the story is the same. See if some of this other stuff doesn't sound familiar to you. Now, when this book was written in the 30s, they didn't use the word alcohol. The word that was used was drunkard. So what he said, Richard Peabody said, once a drunkard, always a drunkard. Now, if you go to our book, it says once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic, because by 1938, 1939, they weren't using the term drunkard anymore. They were using the term alcoholic. So Bill just lifted it and made use of it. And see if some of this other stuff doesn't sound familiar. Of course, a man who has had long periods of abstinence may, on a few occasions, be able to manage things pretty well when he resumes drinking, but sooner or later he will crash harder than ever. How about this one? This time it's going to be different. That's our national anthem. Bill lifted it right out of there. Here's one. See if this doesn't sound familiar to you. Halfway measures are of no avail. Now, in some versions of this book, that's italicized. In mine, it wasn't, but in a lot of versions I've seen, that is italicized. But it doesn't matter. The point is, that became half measures availed us nothing. When people talk about Bill plagiarizing, I think this is the kind of stuff that they're referring to. And there's nothing wrong with it. I think Bill used this better than Peabody did. And Steve's going to tell you a little bit more about Peabody to put this in perspective as to why we look at our book and not his book. So I'll give it back to you for now, Steve.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, he also used the term maladjusted to life and, so many words. I mean, chronic alcoholic, spree, root of the problem, hopeless alcoholic. The Howard mentioned half measure meals, nothing. Drink like a gentleman, I think is in there.
Yep.
Um, but his book describes different types of drinkers. He uses the term hard drinker and alcoholic, real alcoholic, but not the same tone as our book. He uses the terms, but he describes a normal drinker as one who limits himself to a glass of beer and stops because of ill health, which is pretty much right. But and then the writing styles are similar. It's only comparable to our first 43 pages. His book contained no spiritual solution. He rejected spiritual almost completely. He believed, like I said, believed the answer was found in psychology rather than spirituality. Completely rejected it. And his book suggested methods of staying sober, like rigid scheduling and hard work and therapeutic discussion and finding new interests and new and even a love interest and in spiritual daily exercise was something he pushed a lot. But so here's a guy. He's an expert in alcoholism, the leading expert at the time, but so we think, who had tons of self knowledge. He writes the most groundbreaking book on alcoholism. The leading expert. How did he die? He died of alcoholism at 44 years old in 1936, just after 5 years after his groundbreaking book came out. 8 years after he got sober, you know, he died of alcoholism. So if you are alcoholic, you best have a spiritual solution. That's kind of like, you know, the the message there a little bit, and so that's the thing is, you know, um, while these groups played a big part in history of alcoholism, this one, of course, Howard got into it a little bit last week, that plays a big part as well. The most important group, you know, they weren't even even technically a recovery group from this stuff, but they had a recovery plan. I think we don't have a lot of time left. Howard, you just want to get into talking about Bookman a little bit, or Buckman?
Yeah, let's talk about I guess we would call it the pre-Akron beginnings of Alcoholics Anonymous. I talked a little bit about it last week, and I'm just going to buzz through it quickly again, just to put this stuff in perspective. Let me get this for you if you give me a second. Uh, there we go. This may seem familiar if some of you were here last week, and I hate to be repetitious, but it is what we're talking about. So let's take a look at this. How did the Oxford group come about? In 1902, this guy, Robert Speer, wrote an article called The Principles of Jesus, applied to some questions of today, in which he stated that Jesus taught four standards: purity, honesty, unselfishness, and love. Where have I heard that before? In 1909, one of Speer's students, Henry Wright, wrote his own book called The Will of God in Man's Life Work, in which he referred to his teacher's book, but he also coined the term the Four Absolutes. So in his book, The Will of God is the first time we heard the use of the expression absolute purity, absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness, absolute love. And one of Henry Wright's students was a man by the name of Frank Bookman. Buchman. I know it looks like Buckman, but it's pronounced Bookman. In 1909, this guy, Frank Bookman, had a profound spiritual experience in which he said, I saw my resentment standing out like tombstones in my heart. I asked God to change me, and he told me to put things right with those I'd wronged. And that produced in me a vibrant feeling, as though a strong current of life had been poured into me and left in me a dazed sense of having a great spiritual shakeup. In about 1922, he started a ministry that
Okay,
was first
Howard,
called,
can I read really quick what,
yeah,
what, so one thing to bring it up to par, what is, he basically had a board of directors and he got mad at all of them. And he went to, I believe it was the Keswick Convention, and I'm not 100% about this, Keswick Convention in England, to get away from it all. He got fired from his own board, and FB Mayer was supposed to speak, and I don't remember the name of the woman, or Jesse Penn Lewis wound up speaking, preaching about restitution for harm and resentment. And that was the old term mean restoring something. So he sits there and listens to it, and this is his thoughts, and a little bit what Howard mentions here. It's from one of their books. It says, "I thought of the six men who had from the board who wronged me. I saw that the moment that I was the sixth wrong man, I began to see myself as God saw me, which was a very different picture than one I had of myself. I can only tell you, I sat there and realized how my wrongs, my pride, and my selfishness and my ill will had eclipsed me from God. I saw my resentments against those men standing out like tombstones in my heart. I asked God to change me, and He told me to put things right with them. I wrote six letters of restitution to the board members. It produced in me a vibrant feeling as though strong current life had suddenly been poured into me, and afterward a dazed sense of great spiritual shakeup. I immediately started taking others through confession and restitution, and eventually the absolutes. But anyways, that kind of like Howard said, sounds like a spiritual experience.
yep. All right, let me just continue a little bit of this. Rob has kind of jumped way ahead of me in the chat. So if you'll kind of ignore what's in the chat for the next couple of minutes, because he's a little bit ahead of the story. Um, as we said, so he started this first century Christian fellowship, which eventually became known as the Oxford Group, and they strove for absolute purity, absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness and love. And they believed in the practice of these tenets that you can achieve those absolutes by surrender to God, listening for God's directions, making restitution for wrongs, confession and sharing of one's sins. In 1918, a minister protege of Bookman's by the name of Sam Shoemaker, that should sound familiar to some of you, was feeling spiritually lost, inadequate, unfulfilled, and disconnected. And he went on a mission together to China with Bookman, and Bookman advised him to look within himself in terms of those four absolutes, the equivalent of today's moral inventory. Shoemaker does so and said the same thing that Dr. Book at Frank Bookman said, that his sins rose before him like tombstones and resulted in him having a profound spiritual experience. His transformation was so strong, he became the leader of the Oxford groups and in 1924 established their world headquarters at New York's Calvary Episcopal Church on Gramercy Park in New York. Now, at the same time, wealthy industrialist alcoholic Roland Hazard returned from his treatment in Switzerland under Dr. Jung with directions to find a spiritual solution as the only way to solve his problem with alcohol. The Hazard family was a major contributor to the Calvary Episcopal Church, which I didn't realize until recently. So he went there, met with Sam Shoemaker, and here again, is it odd or is it God that his family had invested in that particular church? So he went to that church, and that minister was Sam Shoemaker. And Sam Shoemaker helped him have a spiritual experience, and he became an active Oxford grouper. Shoemaker, this guy Roland Hazard, eventually dedicated one of his homes in Bennington, Vermont, as a sort of drying out farm for all alcoholics, and that's what this looks like. But you may know the name of Roland Hazard because he's one of the people who rescued Ebby Thatcher from being sentenced to an indeterminate term at Leighton Hall Asylum in Brattleboro, Vermont. But one of the people there was Roland Hazard. And Roland brought him through the Oxford Group's soul surgery. And these were their activities: confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, continuance. In the fall of 1934, Ebby, who had taken up residence at the Calvary Mission, starts to think about his drinking buddy, Bill Wilson, who he hears is drinking himself to death in Brooklyn. And so he decides to pay a call on him, and the rest is history. But what happened to the Oxford Group? Why are we here and not the Oxford Group? Well, let's take a look at that a little bit. And this is where Rob had jumped ahead of me a little bit, but let me just put some of these up. Um, oh, you know what? Where's Rob got it? Here we go. Well, I'm going to have to put it up because you can't see Rob's. Can you see that? No. All right, let me pick it out here. Make it easier to see. Sorry for taking your time to do this, but here's what. Let me get the screen so you could see it. And I apologize for bullshitting around here like this. Where is it? Ah, there it is. Okay. The Oxford Group, as we said, they believed in their absolute purity, honesty, unselfishness, love objectives, and they believe they can achieve that by practicing these spiritual activities, which you may think, well, it sounds a little bit like our 12 steps. And it is, because that's where Bill took the idea for the 12 steps. But the Oxford Group believed that you can change the world by changing a person who changes a home, who changes a community, who changes a nation, and changes a world. And that's where he ran into trouble. Because in the late 30s, Frank Bookman made a tour of Europe and visited some of the heads of state to try and head off World War II. And one of the places he visited was Nazi Germany. And when he came back from that trip, he was quoted in a New York paper as saying, I thank heaven for a man like Adolf Hitler, who built a frontline defense against the anti-communism, the antichrist of communism. And here's what that paper looked like. And you can imagine what happened after that. In the late 30s, you don't get quoted supporting Adolf Hitler in a New York paper. And that was the end of the Oxford groups as we know them. They changed names to Moral Rearmament and a couple of different variations, and they still exist to this day. They're still around under different names, but that's why we don't talk about the Oxford groups. And there's one other thing I want to show you, and then I'm going to give you back to Steve, is why did Bill not mention the Oxford groups in the first edition of the Big Book? Did anyone ever think about that? Well, I'll show you why. Right here. All right. And incidentally, any of these things that I've put up, any of these screen shares, if you want a copy of, just drop me a line at the big book study at AOL.com and I'll send it to you. But this is why Bill did not use the words Oxford Group in the first edition of the Big Book. He said, I had to ask myself which was more important, that the Oxford Group receive credit, that I have the pleasure of so discharging my debt, because he felt a debt of gratitude to the Oxford groups. And he felt if he mentioned them, he would discharge that. Or that alcoholics everywhere have the best possible chance to stay alive, regardless of who gets credit. And the reason for that line of thinking is we had enough going against us as alcoholics in 1938 and 1939. We did not need to, in any way, shape, or form, be connected with somebody who made a pro Nazi statement. The first use of the words Oxford Group appeared in the second edition, which appeared in 1955 in the foreword to the second edition. That's why Bill didn't use the words Oxford Group at all anywhere in the first edition. Neither did any of the personal stories as well. Steve?
All right, that was awesome. One thing I wanted to read is, and this is just from one of their books, is this, it says the central idea, and I found this fascinating. The central idea of the Oxford Group was the problems of the world could be healed to a movement of personal dynamic change. This change came about through a set of core ideas and practices for daily living, believing that the root of the problem was, this sounds familiar, dishonesty, selfishness, resentment, and fear. Members were taught how to seek guidance from within rather than creed or the Bible. Believing in experience with God, which means action, rather than biblical doctrine. They believed that the bridges of powerlessness needed to be crossed in order to receive power. Sounds familiar. Um, so they're God centered in the place of self centered. And one thing they pushed the big was to be selfless rather than selfish. That was one of the things they pushed a lot. Um, Give me one second. So the one thing I just want to kind of run through something really quick is, Howard mentioned all these things, but like these principles to surrender our past, present is their procedures are past, present, and future into God's keeping and direction. There's a little more to it, but almost sounds like the third step to me. And it's like, and Shoemaker has a quote where he says, "We must surrender our will to a greater will. That will set us free. Self surrender is a turning point of a spiritual life." And then, so after they surrendered, they would ask them to examine their self, and they were asked to, review their life and be absolutely honest. And they, look at those that are angry, and then, and Shoemaker suggested to some, it was just loosely talked, write it down. I don't know if you call it moral inventory or not, but I don't think there was columns involved. But their second procedure then was the sharing of our sins and temptation then again to God. So there's stuff in between all this stuff. There's hundreds of tenets they had, but the sharing of our sins and temptation that they're given to God, that's where their confession comes in. He Shoemaker always says that he always uses the word human hearer need to validate your confession. And then then where's probably the conviction came in, the deep, awareness, realization, maybe that our wrongs, our resentments what shut yourself off from God. And then the conversion happened somewhere in there. And then the awakening of spiritual knowledge, and understanding that maybe hadn't been previously, realized. And what happens? Change of morals, change of attitude, change of thoughts, lifestyle, personality. And the restitution to all those we've wronged directly and indirectly. Sound familiar? Sounds like step 9. And Shoemaker said, our relationship with God cannot, as my favorite Shoemaker quote, our relationship with God cannot be right unless relationships with others are right as well. For it is pointless to keep in touch with God so long as there are other human relationships which must be right at the same time. Bam. You know, and they push the continuance somewhere in there too, maybe at the end of all these four. And that was, you know, that was the absolutes. And then they had listening for God's guidance and carrying it out. Sounds like step 11. Quiet time they had, and they were big on that. Um, and Bookman believed that the best way to keep an experience with God was to pass it to another. And then so they had wasn't a four procedures there, but it was one of them to keep the convergence experience real by carrying the oxygen message of salvation to others. And it sounds like 12. And saw this recently. I'll put it up on the screen. And because they changed them after a while, and I saw this with Drew put the thing up. And let me share my screen. I almost forgot how to do it for a second. And it's just more deeper and more AA 12 step-ish me, but it says surrender to God, rigorous self-examination, confessions of character defects to another human being, make restitution for harms done to others, give without, I should say, thought of reward, pray and seek guidance in all matters, study scripture, read literature, lead by example. One might motivate others. In order to keep it, you have to give it away. And then they had the 5 C's and the 4 absolutes after that. And then, oops, self-sacrifice versus self-centeredness. And if you look at this original, I mean, it's not the original AA 6-step program, but because if you could go the block over in New York and they might do them slightly different. And I think Bill jotted these down in the 50s or so. But originally the story here, and Howard's heard this before, is basically Bill was getting people to turn their lives to God, and it was allegedly he went to Silkworth, and Silkworth said, "Well, why don't you give him the medical facts first? Why don't you give him the allergy, the obsession and all that, the powerlessness?" And he was failing, so he had these Oxford Group 5 steps, and the moral inventory, confession, restitution, helping others, and praying for God. I mean, that's before the other one, but he slapped on powerlessness. We're defeated. And within weeks later, the first person he talked to, that was Dr. Bob. Boom. And imagine if he would have gone to Dr. Bob and said, you got to turn your life over to God. And, Dr. Bob famously said that, you know, if 5 minute conversation turned into 5 hours, he would have brought me anything else. He would slam a door in his face. And he said that about Bill Wilson, he was the first living human who spoke of alcoholism from actual experience. And to piggyback a little bit on what Howard says, AA, I mean, we benefited them from their mistakes. What he did when, tangled up in politics, internal affairs, and the war and all that, public matters, and it destroyed it. AA, one of our traditions is AA has no opinion on outside issues. I wonder where that came from. You know, it's a lesson AA learned from the Oxford group, so it goes pretty deep. You know, um, I think next week, Howard, you want to say anything at the end? Did you have something you want to do? I forgot.
Uh, no, I just wanted to, next week, we're going to actually crack open the book and
Oh my
start
God.
by page. You thought we forgot about that, huh?
Yeah,
We're
yeah, we'll
actually
give him the
in
book.
the big book study.
All right, let me stop the recording and we'll